I was really fortunate to be at UCLA, where the scholarship coming out of UCLA was grounded in critical pedagogy, really questioning the structures of our systems and how that implements or how that impacts our lived experiences as people and in our schools. And having that foundation, that framework really helps me have a strength of power, not feeling like, oh, just because I'm learning critical race theory, that's not because I'm now feeling like a victim in my communities. No, it's helping me understand, no, were actually created, but they were created by humans. So as a human, as a person, I have the ability and the power to change that as well. And so that's what really inspired me to become an educator. And I joined UCLA's teacher education program, as Dr. O'Leary mentioned, where I was able to be grounded in that theoretical framework in the work that I do. And as Paulo Freire talks about, being engaged in that praxis, that action grounded in that theory. And so that brings me to this work of being in schools. And it's not just about the curriculum, it's not just about the content. Starting to realize as I grew as an organizer that it's also about how we relate with one another. It's about how do we acknowledge that oftentimes, even in our own organizing spaces, it reproduces harm, reproduces toxic masculinity, reproduces heteropatriarchy. And how do we, even in our own spaces, where we are seeking to work together to transform the systems, how do we, even in those spaces, begin to recognize how we have internalized a lot of the harm and the trauma of these systems, and when going unexamined, we can be reproduced in our very own spaces. Which brings me to the work of healing justice. I was, again, really fortunate to be in organizing spaces that led me to a collective of other folks that were interested in asking the question of, well, how do we have a critical ethnic studies approach in our schools? And how do we make sure that we are organizing other educators who have this stance in our work, and ensure that we don't get isolated, ensure that we don't get pushed out of the profession, because our communities need us present. And so I'm also one of the founders of the People's Education Movement. We started in Los Angeles and South LA. Many of us were educators in South LA. And some of the things that we really asked about is, well, how do we, in response to the heteropatriarchy that we often experience, how do we start to embrace Black feminist work? How do we start to embrace transformative justice work, restorative justice work? How do we start to implement transformative justice work in our spaces? And how can abolition work, the long history of abolition, inform the way that we organize together and the way we dream? And so that's my context. And so I just wanted to share that story to kind of ground you all in why I'm sharing this work today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. And so I'm super fortunate to be able to talk with you all about healing justice in schools. And as we talk about that, I think that's something that's really important to talk about in our context in the United States is, well, who were schools originally created for? So this is a drawing of the first public school here in the States. And this school was designed for white, wealthy boys, men. And so it's important to start to question from here, well, okay, so who were schools initially for and for what purpose? And so another iteration that we see of schools is the Indian boarding schools. And this photo is from let me grab the date. I do want to be accurate here, but Indian boarding schools was a form of cultural genocide. Not only was there physical genocide of the indigenous communities and populations here in this country. What we have also experienced as a form of cultural genocide are these indigenous boardings, or these Indian boarding schools. So here, this is a photo from the late 1800s of of young people that were stolen from their tribes, stolen from their homes, and were forced to be in these distant schools, completely isolated from their communities, and doing practices such as cutting hair, which is in various indigenous communities very sacred and has different meanings. Putting them in Western dress, right? Burning their tongues if they spoke their native languages. These are the types of practices that schools had on the first people here on this land that we are on, that many of us are here on. And just to acknowledge the land I'm coming from, I am coming from Tongva settler colonial Los Angeles, so Tongva land. And so here we see, if we juxtapose this, here are schools only for exclusively white men, wealthy white men. And then we now see here schools meant to support the continued genocide for the interest of settler colonialism, the interest of settlers coming from other places to come to this land to steal it and be able to use it for their own interests. And what they do with the children that do remain, that have not experienced that violence of genocide, they now are put through a different form of violence. And here we have from 1885, Mammy Tape in the center, an 8-year-old Chinese American who wanted to have access to a public school and was denied because the school was only meant for white students. And also here in California, in Westminster, we have Sylvia Mendez, who led the struggle for desegregating schools in Westminster, and this is now in 1844. So a couple years later, after Mammy Tape, where they were able to actually fight for the desegregation of schools that Mexican American children were experiencing in California. And then many of us are also aware of the landmark case in 1954 of Brown v. Board versus Education, Brown v. Board of Education. And I apologize. I said 1844. I meant 1944 for Sylvia Mendez. So just a couple years later, from 1944 to 1954, we have Brown v. Board, where interesting Black schools were very rich. There's incredible educators grounded. If we talk about culturally relevant, all of that was happening in Black schools. But what we also saw was that a lot of Black schools that experienced the horrors of the Jim Crow segregation era was the denial of access to quality resources, right? And so in the struggle after Brown v. Board, the solution was integration. But what we see here is this continued violence on communities of color. And this is a very powerful image that is really etched into our historical memory here as a country, of how children of color are in schools experiencing remnants of this violence. Here we see this iconic picture of Elizabeth Eckford, part of the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, 1957, where they were actually trying to fight to implement Brown v. Board of Education. Yet we actually see National Guardsmen from the governor blocking entryway into this school. We see Hazel Bryan right behind Elizabeth yelling, right? It's such a powerful image of white rage and white rage of communities of color just demanding, or just not even demanding, just seeking our dignity. And that brings me here to talking about the roots of of trauma here in this country. And so we have, if we talk about the roots of trauma, we have to talk about Western imperialism. We have to talk about how, with the advent of emerging science, in Western science and technology and emerging capitalism, what we're seeing is, oh, well, they're learning how to improve the way we produce goods. And now we have an excess, we have a surplus of goods. Where are we going to make more profit? Well, we now know how to build boats. We know how to travel. Maybe we can go travel and seek other markets to sell these surplus goods. And what we see in that process is, well, now we're also seeing a lot of these Western Europeans coming out with this technology, now saying, well, all these other lands or areas that we're traveling to, they're now starting to make a connection, like, of looking at their looking at their phenotypic typic differences. Oh, we are white skinned and they are dark skinned. And then this is where we start to see this concept of white supremacy, where, wow, these people, look at how they, like, what are they, how are they coming to these ideas? So starting to question and to position their sense of knowing, epistemology, as more supreme, right? As a way to help justify coming into these lands. Another thing that we see is the supremacy of their ontology, right? Like, oh, look at how these other people, look at how they live, like the way they do things, like, that's right. So we're now seeing the growth of that form of white supremacy, that of ontology, thinking that their way of being is superior. And then also the axiology, so the way, what we consider, what we value as good, what we value as beautiful, we start to see that emerge in this period of Western imperialism. And then continuing to see, well, how do we start to have, how do we sustain our power? We came to these lands, they have a lot of resources, these people are kind of in the way. So how do we try to get access so that we can continue to sell, we can get rid of our surplus goods, but maybe even have access to resources to produce other kinds of goods, or make money off the goods that come from these lands that we are coming to. And so what we see is different forms of colonialism, either colonialism where these Western colonizers are now saying, we're just gonna control them from afar. We're gonna set up all these systems. And if people try to fight back, we'll set up these different systems like police to be able to control the population. Or we also had versions of settler colonialism, where we had people actually coming from Western lands, coming to live on these lands and saying, actually, we're just gonna reside here permanently and just maintain control from here directly. And so we see that in different areas of the world. And now when we bring it to our context here in the United States, not only do we have settler colonialism, we also have this history of chattel slavery, this specific form of slavery of stealing people from other lands, building a whole economic enterprise around that, and stealing their personhood in order to be able to uphold their economic interests and political interests, which we have as capitalism here in our context. And as people struggle, as abolitionists fought for the freedom, having the legal right for people to be considered, for Black folks in our country to be considered citizens, now the United States finding new creative ways. Well, how do we still get to exploit labor? How do we still get to have cheap labor? Because now these citizens are fighting for right. Black citizens are now fighting for equal rights. Well, how can we continue to capitalize? Well, now how do we extract that labor from other countries? So now so what we're seeing is the brain drain, either taking professionals from other countries, bringing them here, or actually just we're doing political work of destabilizing other countries so that communities have no choice but to flee their countries, flee their places, so that they have somewhere safe to be. And so we see all that. And amidst all this, there is also underlying heteropatriarchy, ableism, right? Starting to value, oh, only able bodies are valuable, right? And so how do we only cater to able bodies? Xenophobia. How do we demonize folks who are not from our country, whatever that means? And then also even forms of religious supremacy. And so in this image here, what I have here is, how do we see how these roots of trauma, how does this operate in terms of race, gender, age, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, language, religion, color, nationality, ability status, family status, all of these different, uh, and occupation, your level of education. How do all of these intersect and inform how communities experience trauma? And so to bring it to, and so this is something where I actually want to pause, because I know that was a lot. And I want to bring it back to why we are here today, which is talking about schools. So I would actually like to invite our participants to type in the chat and respond to this question. How do schools, or the institutions that we're in, so not only individual schools, but the institutions of schooling, how does it reproduce cultures of violence and trauma? What are your thoughts on that? Because I want to be able to respond to some of the things that brought you to this space. So yeah, how do our schools reproduce these cultures? I'm wondering if folks are able to type in the chat.
Yes, folks should be able to respond to that question.
Okay. All right. Give a couple moments, so I'll bring back the slide on the screen. So, how do schools reproduce the cultures of violence and trauma? What are some of your thoughts?
I have a few responses. One member wrote, one of the factors will be the home environment. Another participant wrote, every day in almost every way, banning hairstyles, organizations that are opposed to the school rules, textbooks that deny history or misrepresent it. And then another participant wrote, I feel that sometimes people may look another way or not consider some injustices that are still going on today.
Yeah. Thank you. And so what's bringing you all to the space? Like what are some of the things that maybe you have witnessed or you are currently experiencing? What are examples of maybe some of the things that you hope to address in schools? What brings you all to this space? I'm used to a more interactive form of presenting, but yes, thank you.
Have a few more responses. Someone wrote, I think ontology is a big part of how schools reproduce separation and cause division that result in violence and trauma. Another participant wrote, by not caring for their students and letting students do what they want instead of what is right.
Wow. Yeah, that's all of this is so powerful. Thank you all for those responses.
Another response, not addressing issues that are highly important, especially now with students' social emotional status.
Mm,
Someone said the reason why they're here is to, I guess, reimagine the educational system with more trauma informed programs filled with trauma informed educators for all.
mhm, mhm. Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you all. And I see, oh, there's a few more coming in. Thank you all.
Don't want to leave anyone's comments out. We have another participant writes, targeting specific groups of students to search their belongings or doing drug tests. Guess that's an example of what it looks like on campus.
Hmm.
And then someone writes, I've been teaching for respect since 1982, and I once believed we would accomplish equity. Now I realize we have so many layers to challenge and change. American schools have done so much damage to every student.
Mm, yes, yes, thank you all. Thank you. No pause if there's one more response. If not, I'm going to go ahead and move. So, oh, there's one more. Let's go ahead and read that one.
Certainly. I believe that schools can invest more time into building stronger relationships with families and the community to find ways that the school systems can further support them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so for me, I really, and I know it was really important for me to talk about here the roots of trauma, because all of these intersect, and they provide that history of where all of this is coming from, right? A lot of times our communities and even ourselves, we don't have the language to to be able to explain why we're feeling certain things, or sometimes when we don't have that language to name it, oftentimes it just becomes accepted as, well, this is just what it is. It is what it is. That's how things are. But for me, I wanted to share this history to show that there are levels, just as I believe Tanya said, right? There's layers in this work, right? It's beyond this one solution. There's actually all these intersecting layers: imperialism, supremacy, colonialism, chattel slavery, capitalism, right? There's so many layers, right? And so for me, healing justice is so key now when we talk to this. So this healing justice is a framework um, that was developed in the early 2000s with Cara Page, and also with the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. And so in the early 2000s, this collective of healers, health practitioners, nurses, therapists who were multi-ethnic, so Black feminists, folks of color, Indigenous people, and white racists, they all were starting to question, well, man, like, how do we address what's happening in our movements, where we're seeing people burning out? We're seeing people feel like, oh, we got to leave in order to take care of ourselves. Well, weren't these movements created so that we can actually help our communities? And so now we're starting to feel like we can't be in them anymore because it's just so toxic. And so this collective organized with LGBTQ, working class, Black, and people of color. And they really started to talk about, well, healing justice it's anti-capitalist. It's recognizing that capitalism is one of the roots that create these conditions. Healing justice is abolitionist. Healing justice is recognizing that we come from a long history of people who have been survived, that have been creative, that have found ways to come together to figure out how we can get our needs met, and how do we continue that tradition, and how do we continue to ask, well, what can we do, what can we build? Healing justice is about transforming institutions that that are that an extension of the roots of trauma. And so, really, if we want to take away, if there's any takeaway that we can take about what healing justice is, it's about collective care, it's about wellness, and it's about safety. And so, the questions that the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective asked as they were doing this work is, well, how do we build collective well-being emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychically, and environmentally for our communities? How do we build that? How do we have healing, collective well-being, and safety that is inseparable from economic, environmental, and disability justice? And I want to raise that point to say that, this work isn't just something that we do. Healing justice isn't something that you do independently. It's not its own thing that you can just do in like it's not just an independent strategy. It is actually highly informed by and interconnected with the struggles for economic justice, for environmental justice, for disability justice. So when we talk about healing justice in schools, we have to ask, well, how are we also thinking about economic justice? How are we thinking about environmental justice? How are we thinking about disability justice as we are advocating for healing justice? And again, just to go back to the first question, how is it also about building our collective well being, not just individual care, not just self care, but our collective care? And how do we do that on a physical level? Right? Because we have we have our physical needs, but our spiritual needs, psychologically and environmentally. And so some of the ways that we can start to come as we start to narrow in to the individual is, well, what is generational trauma? How has that deeply affected ourselves? And how do we hold both individual and collective trauma in movements so it's not siloed, right? Again, like I said, it's not just something that we say, oh, you have trauma, go deal with it over there, right? You can go outside, you can go to that thing over there and deal with that, right? But again, how do we recognize that when we talk about trauma, and how do we address it? How is it integrated in all of the strategies that we're doing? So for example, in the people's education movement, as we started the space, it was always important to do a grounding exercise. And to be able to acknowledge our needs in our bodies, and how we need to become aware of that, and bring that awareness into the space as we join together. And how do we build community? How do we honor our humanity? How do we check in with each other? How do we make sure, oh, you're not only valuable because of what you do, right? A capitalist notion of what's valuable, not because of what you can produce, but like, because I care about you as a human being. How are you doing? How can we help you? How can we support you? Right. And so in that, what is our relationship to land, work, body, and spirit? And so I actually wanted to really just kind of have a dialogue with you all, which really is why we're all here with in terms of healing justice in schools. Well, how do we start to build that collective safety and care in our schools? So I'll pause there because I'm seeing some folks typing in the chat, and I do want to acknowledge what they've been sharing. So I believe the next person that had something to share was Christina.
Yes, Christina writes, I think sometimes in the educational system, there's a lot of stress and pressure, and that energy gets transferred into the classroom with students, and the negative energy is then bounced back throughout. It has definitely changed from the way it used to be many years ago.
Hmm.
And then Tracy writes, I strongly feel that there must be more programs to educate teachers, staff, administrators about these particular topics. Most of professional developments and trainings, we have target differentiated instruction, or new teaching strategies, accountability, end of year exams like STAR. But I think these topics should be focus points in our teacher training professional development. We have so many, so we should be able to incorporate some in there.
Yeah. Yeah, y'all. So Tracy, you were already feeling, you were sensing where this conversation was going. So yes, I want to know, how can we start to build collective safety And so in the spirit of healing justice, how do we build collective safety and care in our schools, right? So I do want this to be a space where we can collectively share and have that conversation. So already in response to this, Tracy's sharing, well, how do we rethink our professional development, right? Great. So how can we start? So what I'm throwing back to Tracy is, well, what support do you have with that idea? What challenges do you anticipate, and what support will you need? And I ask that because here at Minty, our goal is to actually be able to go out into schools and support you all with this work. And so this is a great idea of what we can do, but you're here for a reason, right? So what support do you have, and what challenges do you anticipate with trying to do that? And what support would you need? Have another response.
All right, this is from Dr. Huber. I find less resistance from administration and community and funding sources when I frame my work against capitalism and white supremacy within the United Nations and the 2015 SDGs, Sustainable Development Solutions work, Australia Pacific 2017. Getting started with the SDGs in universities, a guide for universities, higher education institutions, and the academic sector, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Edition. Sustainable Development Solutions, Australia Pacific, Melbourne, Australia, and then there's a link for you. A guide for university engagement and sustainable development goals, including tools and guidance for integration and case studies. So I believe Dr. Huber is providing a resource for folks to click on and to engage in. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. I'm curious, Dr. Huber, so what you say, you find less resistance. When you do that, why do you think that is? Why is that the case, that you find less resistance when you frame it in that way?
And Dr. Emily, I have found a way to allow the participants to speak, so I'm going to allow Dr. Huber an opportunity to talk.
Oh, awesome.
Thank you. I wasn't sure how to answer because I didn't know how to unmute myself. Thank you, Dr. O'Leary. Well, I'm not new to this work. As an educator, I actually started this in the 70s and naively thought, I'm the one who said in 82, I thought, we'll resolve this. Of course, the more I studied and the more I learned, the more I realized this is so deeply entrenched in all aspects of life in this country that when I use language that scares the administration, or I use language in grant funding, right now in the state of Texas, if you say critical race theory, everyone goes up in arms.
Yeah.
So I learned decades ago, though, that when I say white supremacist, half the room is going to turn me off or want me out. Mm-hmm. And so I've had to be, and I'm seen as a white woman. I'll just say I'm seen as a white woman. I'm gonna put an ellipsis after that and say that that's had a positive in that it allows me to say things at a table that I know colleagues of mine haven't been able to say over the years. I can get away with it because I'm seen as an educated white woman. But it's helped me to learn that I have to almost figure out how to nest my work in meaningful ways so that they don't always see me coming. And I think that's not possible for everybody, but I've found that even with students, if I hit them over the head with white supremacy, they back away. But I've been teaching race courses since 1990 at the university level. And I find if I can give them the examples, if I can show them the situations, Dr. Bautista, similar to what you did, when I show them the early Indian schools and the early African-American schools in this country and how awesome they were, they're shocked because they didn't know they existed. Like they didn't know. They didn't know students were sent to off-reservation boarding schools. They didn't know that the Cherokee were already educating their children before that happened. They didn't know that African Americans were educating their youth and sending them to colleges. They had no idea, because we don't teach that in our schools. So I find a lot of it is getting the correct history into the studies without always naming it as critical race theory or anti-white supremacy education. I simply look at it as educating them more completely. And I've had violent Klan members literally say, KKK in Oklahoma at a rally, literally say, I never knew this. And I blame us as educators that we haven't challenged our system to do a better job of education. I could obviously talk till midnight, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Huber. And I wanted to raise up the next comment that was brought in.
All right, I work as an educational specialist for the largest network of nonprofit charter schools in Cali, and I love that one of our key values is building strong connections with student and family. We believe in teaching the whole student, and that includes social emotional education. Educators need to be more malleable and ready to pivot based on student needs. If I hear another teacher say, I teach math, I'm not a social worker, or their parent, or fill in the blank, school was my favorite place to be as a kid. I never wanted to go home. My teacher was the only trusted adult I had in my life. I made this my career because I know how important it is to the well-being of our youth. I can also allow Stephanie to talk if she would prefer.
Yeah, Stephanie, would you like to share that experience of key values of building strong connections with student and family, where in that setting, teaching the whole student, including social emotional education? What do you think what are the conditions that allow you all to be able to do that?
What I enjoy about our school is they are specialized education where we want to make it a one-on-one opportunity for the student. It's not a traditional setting with 30 kids in the class or 50 kids in the class. They come to their first appointment with a teacher, and you kind of just get to know the student. Why are they in a school where they are working independently? Why is this a model that works for them? And usually there's an obstacle involved. You know, I'm the primary caretaker of my younger siblings while my parents work, and a traditional school, you know, you have to go every single day. So independent study works a little bit better for me and I can work on my own. Or I got pregnant when I was 15 and I dropped out, and now I'm ready to come back and get that high school diploma. There's always a reason. And if we get to know what the obstacles of the student is, then you know how to teach them a little bit better. You know what they're working with, you know how to support them. And I didn't have that when I worked at a traditional setting in a larger high school with much more affluent enrollment. They didn't see the same issues. They didn't care what the obstacles were. It just was very, very different. And the model of independent study and really figuring out how to teach to the student and their needs was really important. And I found out a lot about different types of populations and different types of obstacles. And if they feel that you are someone that can be trusted, because if you are fake, you can be, you know, they can smell it a mile away. They might actually tell you what their obstacles are, and they might buy into their own education and how important it is for them because you believe in them and you care about them. So just the idea of caring, it's really, really simple. I'm kind of shocked how difficult it is for so many educators, that it's really just a matter of caring and willing to step outside of whatever your frame of reference is and try and get to know your students on a personal level and just treat them as such.
Thank you. Thank you for unmuting and sharing. We have another response that I feel is in response to maybe what you shared.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Tracy King, and I feel so strong about this topic because I've experienced it in the classroom, and you know, I feel that we need more support from administrators and district personnel. And I'm just going to read a little bit of what I wrote. We teach a test, we do, and being in an actual classroom has taught me that it is not just about a test. I want to make a difference. And that's a prime reason why I'm getting my master's, because I feel that, I don't know if some administrators they forget how it really is to be in the classroom with those students, and that every student is different. And just an example, I did have a transgender student in my classroom, and that student would cry every day because she felt that she wasn't, teachers would refuse to call her by the name she wanted, and admin would as well. And she felt that she wasn't, that they didn't respect the community, that they didn't respect her. And that broke my heart, because whatever she told me, I mean, I did, because I always think also like students need to like you in order to learn from you. Like, that's just my thing. I feel like I'm always positive in my classroom. Like, I address every student by their name. I know every student, what they like to do, their hobbies, and I try to build that rapport, and they like that, And I feel like if you're going to refuse to call them something, I mean, just because it says something different on paper, like that's what hurt my heart. For other people to actually just turn the other way and pretend that this is something that is not, it's humanity. Like, I don't know, I just feel really strong about it. And I think that we do need more support from admin and the district. It's not just about a test, in my opinion.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you. I see Carolina shared a response with the panelists. Dr. O'Leary, do you mind sharing it out?
Certainly. Carolina responds, Stephanie and Tracy, I completely agree with you all. Being in the classroom so much more than just teaching a subject. I had a really negative experience in elementary school, and it is why I decided to become an educator. We have to realize that our influence goes beyond the classroom, and sometimes teachers are the only positive role model students have in their life.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina, for sharing that. And then Dr. O'Leary, I think you had shared another comment, or maybe we'll just see if they respond.
I wanted to invite, but I don't want to.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So not sure if they saw that, but okay. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I'm just really appreciating the energy so far of folks chiming in and talking about, yes, I mean, the care is so key. Yeah. And in my work as a principal, that's, I shared when I was in the classroom, I've had to ask myself that, like, how do I know in my spirit that I knew I cared, but also another thing is, well, how do your students know you care? Right. And there is that element of, well, every student is different. So just because you care and you show in this way, it doesn't mean that that's, actually, Dr. O'Leary, that's something she brought when we worked together. When we were working together, she brought the love languages concept to us, right? It's like, well, I mean, maybe that's your love language, but what's the student's love language? Like, would they even see your love language as love for them? And so what is the work that we're doing to even get to know our students, get to know the kinds of barriers or the things that they're going through, or the things that do make them feel seen, do make them feel heard, right? And that is a highly interpersonal relationship building process, right? But how do we recognize that that is part of the healing work? It's essentially recognizing that we're human. How do we see our students as human? Because as we've seen from this history of how you young people of color have been treated in the school spaces that they are primarily in, where they spend a lot of their time, is a lot of harm, right? We've seen so much violence and harm in these schools that are communities that our young people are mandated to go to, in fact, right? They're mandated to go to these spaces, and oftentimes they aren't seen and heard, and they are experiencing that dehumanization. So how do we do that work? And it's interesting that for some of us, we could feel like, oh, well, like it's care, but you know, is that something you teach? Is that something you put in professional development? Like, but also, is it just something that can be supported, right? Lifting up the idea of the importance of school leadership to create the culture and foster the culture where care is okay, right? Care is something that's encouraged. Yeah, thank you. Are there any other?
We have a question.
Oh, yes.
And go ahead, take it away. You have, go ahead and talk.
Okay, hi. I know you asked me to talk for a second. I worked with you all in California. I was just mentioning, I'm in Liberia now. So I'm in Monrovia, Liberia. So I'm at a private school. So the issues are a little bit different here. But I do miss that something at the schools we used to work at in California is that we had something called a mental toughness, or something where we got to know the teachers and the students on a personal level. And I feel like that's something I'm missing here. And I feel like that's something that can help support the culture and getting to know them, and not just teaching them a test or worried about academics, but, no matter what your economical, status, because we teach a lot of, the higher, level of income students, but they have just as many, feelings and, that maybe the local students have as well. So I know that was something that I feel like we're missing in our particular school, is just getting to know who they are and not just expecting them, because they come from a different class, that they don't have issues, they don't have feelings, they don't have interests, So that was something that I really missed, and that I learned from the schools in America that I worked in, is that, having the team building and listening to everyone's voice.
So Dia, it's so cool to hear your voice. So cool to reconnect with you after all these years. Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that. And what I also take from that to add to the conversation is that the importance of staff humanizing themselves, right? That's actually a really that's something that I took in my leader as a school leader, that I developed in that school setting that we shared together. I, for me, understood that it's also about how do we humanize all of us, right? Because all these systems are very dehumanizing, uh, they reproduce this idea of power and privilege and hierarchy, right? And so how do we start to dismantle that by starting to say, no, I'm a human being, and this is how I show up as a human being, right? So I thank you for sharing that, Sudia. And I know we're coming close to our time, but was there any other comments or questions?
There's one more question, and it kind of leads to our wrap up, which is,
Okay.
What is healing justice to you, and how would you start changing this issue?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, to me, like, if there was any takeaways that I would really hope for folks to take with healing justice, is that it's about collective care. It's about wellness. It's about safety, right? And so even when we just start to talk about that in our, even if it's just in your personal life, how do you cultivate a sense of collective care, where it's like, oh, it's my, not like, oh, it's my turn to take, it's I'm just gonna go do my thing, I got some self-care to do. But how do we start to reframe it and shift it as a space of, no, we take care of each other. So it's like, oh, don't feel bad that you got to go do that. Like, yeah, like, it's cool, I got you. Like, the stuff that you were holding, I can hold. And it's important for you to take care of yourself. Or it could be like, well, wait, what's going on, let me help you, right? Like, what do you need? What are you not getting right now? Do you feel safe? What could we do to create a more safe environment, right? So even just starting at the interpersonal level in these ways to cultivate that collective care, but then starting to, as I kind of referenced, well, then how do we also start to question, well, are there certain conditions that are making it so that you can't? Like, is it our work hours? Is it the policies that we have? So then how can we start to raise that up? How can we start to get support from people that have the decision-making power? How can they maybe even share that power, right? How can they create that so that we can have wellness, collective wellness, and collective safety? Yes. And I think we might be pretty close to closing, but I do see more comments in the chat. So Dr. O'Leary.
Yes, we want to honor time. We apologize that we're coming to a close. We have a few announcements to share, and Tracy will definitely try to, and those others who are still commenting below, will definitely try to provide some more opportunities for us to continue to connect with you. But if you all will just do me a favor and just give Dr. Emily some love inside of the chat, give her just appreciations for the information that she shared with us today. And this isn't the end. Like, definitely webinars are only opportunities to introduce to you a framework or a concept, but we definitely invite you to connect with us so that we can come work on your campuses. I mean, we are working with campuses right now in organizations, and this work isn't a one-stop shop work. I mean, this is ongoing work and layers of unpacking and collective care and looking at what does wellness look like for our staff? What does wellness look like for our parents? There are parents who feel every time they walk on campus, they are scrutinized or they're spoken to condescendingly. And so how do we provide those opportunities to have to restore healing for our parents as well as our students, of course, more importantly. So I'm going to share my screen at this time. Dr. Bautista, if you could stop sharing yours. And I just want to make sure that we go over some opportunities for you to stay connected with us, so that this work can continue and it doesn't just stop here. And so we mentioned before that Dr. Emily and I, we are consultants for Mentee Educational Services. Our tagline is the road to educational freedom. And the word mentee, it derives from Harriet Tubman. That was her nickname that her family called her. And so in the spirit of freedom, we want people to be free from toxicity on their campuses. We want people to be free from educational narratives that aren't equitable and truthful to our students. And so we like to partner with educators across the globe to offer an extension of ourselves and of our background and our experiences so that we can educate and create change in your learning communities. So I'm going to be providing you a few different links here. And the first link is, if you're ever interested in learning more about us or consulting with us, that is the link to our website, and we will see you and talk to your administrators or your PLC groups and learn about your specific needs, and then develop a professional learning plan that will support your growth. Up next, we have our next Mentee webinar. This is our last one for the year, so we're gonna make it a little fun and competitive as well. We have one of our consultant partners, Chandra Daniel, who's going to lead, hosted by another one of our consultant partners, Principal Ernani Santos, aka the game orchestrator. They're really going to be talking about the power of school decorum. And I know that may sound like hokey, but really, how do you create spaces where students want to be? How do you empower students before you open your mouth just by what they see or what they feel when they walk on your campus? And what does your school decorum, how does that invite students to see themselves in their culture and recognize their own uniqueness in your learning space? So what is the power of decorum? How can you create equity? How can you create inclusion just in the spaces that you have? And so we have people across the globe who are sending us photos and videos of their learning spaces that they have created that really embraces this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we just want you to share, get some nuggets, And because we're entering into the season of Christmas and people are decorating, we want to give you some ideas so that when you return back from break, you can have some really great opportunities to deck out your learning spaces. So please sign up now so that you can be a part of that. We're really excited. This is going to be off the chain. Please stay in tune. This conference we have, it is scheduled for April 23rd, 2022. It is called the Equity Ingenuity Conference. We will be sending out calls for presenters December 1st. So if you're interested in demonstrating how have you used innovative policy, innovative practices, or innovative pedagogy through the lens of equity, we would invite you to think about being a presenter. It is a virtual presentation, and we have just secured one of the, I call him the one of the current godfathers of equity is gonna be the keynote speaker. I am so excited. I can't share with you at this time, but please look for more information on that and stay tuned. And then last but not least, I'm really excited for this. My colleague and dear friend, Dr. Huber, who we heard from earlier today, she is a guest editor for the Journal of Multicultural Affairs, and they have a call for papers. And really this call focuses on voices, amplifying research, rhetoric, rhythm and rhyme, teaching for global citizenship while fighting for the soul of American democracy. Right now, they're asking for those of you who are interested in sharing your experience, sharing your narrative, giving us your insight and or your research to consider signing up. We have more information here where you can look at the call in greater detail. And if you have any questions, you could submit your manuscripts to the link that was just shared. We want to give a shout out to the Posse group who are our highlighted sponsors for today's webinar. And we thank them for supporting us and having some of their group and their colleagues come on out to hear today's webinar. So shout out again to Posse and a great big heart to our guest editor for this upcoming paper, Dr. Tanya Huber. And that's all we have for you today, folks. We are again so honored and grateful to have you join us. If you have anything that you want to say before we close, you guys may unmute your mics and again, just give Dr. Emily a great shout out, ask any questions. But other than that, we are dismissed and have a great, great, great day. And if we don't get to connect with you again, have a wonderful, relaxing, caring, just all the love that you need for Thanksgiving. We give you those Thanksgiving vibes, and we love you all from the bottom of our heart. Dr. Emily, you have anything you want to say?
Just thank you all. Thank you all, everyone, for being here and for participating. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.